exactly is fake news? And how do we know when we're hearing it? We'll find out right now here on the Tan Talk Radio Network. You are about to enter the no superstition zone of rational thinking and intellectual curiosity here on the Atheist Forum. Standing by for your questions or comments at 727-441-3000, where you can talk to a real live atheist here on Tan Talk 1340. In studio with us tonight, George Hyde, president of Parkhead Associates Media Consulting in Lutz, whom we will look to for some insight on the undefined term fake news. Also in studio are Atheists of Florida member Jim Peterson, my stooge and religion commentator Joe Reinhardt, and me, Ed Golly. Now, Mr. Hyde, it seems in the modern election era, right-wing mistrust of the media was given birth to by the scatterbrained Sarah Palin, who so cleverly denounced the lamestream media, having been tapped to be the running mate of Senator John McCain in 2007. McCain undoubtedly ended up out in the woods sitting around a campfire with a bunch of other guys beating on drums, wondering, what the hell was I thinking? This evolved into the 2016 presidential campaign of Donald Trump, who seemed to denounce the media and the very institution of a free press as fake news whenever any report came out that was in any way critical of Mr. Trump, except when they reported his fake news Time magazine covers. Mr. Hyde, what I have never heard is anybody define a report or published article in any of the mainstream press and then tell us why it's fake news. Define it as fake news and tell us why. They simply make this blanket statement that critical news is fake news, but they can never explain why. Is there actually fake news coming out of the mainstream media?
Oh, I think there's fake news coming out of just about every orifice that's out there in the press today. In one way, shape, or another. And it's not like it started with Sarah Palin. Now, first of all, Ed, I'll give you a great deal of credit for understanding that fake news did not start with the nomination of Donald Trump. That was not the start of fake news. If you go back far enough, you can find this article that I was reading earlier today about the fake news that sealed the fate of Antony and Cleopatra. And this was, in fact, the circulation of a claim by Octavian in the Second Triumvirate about some methods of divvying up the Roman Empire that Mark Antony and Cleopatra were supposedly going to engage in to pass on a lot of valuable property in the Roman Empire to their children. So the idea of fake news and fake news having an economic impact or a significant interpersonal impact is no newer than the Second Triumvirate, and that's an awfully long time ago. In fact, this was really considered to be one of the elements that led up to the deaths of Antony and Cleopatra and the establishment of more of an individual bureaucracy at the head of Rome back in those days. So, with regard to that, it's older than that. However, it has become popular. The Oxford English Dictionary, which we've all maybe taken a look at from time to time, or maybe even tried to lift, because it is so heavy and a multi-volume reference work. Interestingly enough, did not select fake news as the word of the year. Most of us probably would have. It seemed to be the phrase that was on everybody's lips. It was omnipresent. Everybody's saying, well, fake news, fake news, fake news. If they weren't accusing some transmission of information of being fake news, they were using it as a punchline to a joke. And in fact, the OED in 2017 picked the term youthquake. Youthquake as being the term of the year. A significant cultural, political, or social change arising from the actions or influences of young people. Now, I'm assuming, obviously with Oxford in their name, that they were heavily influenced by things that happened on the British Isles and the influence of younger voters in Brexit and its consequences. But I think if you did that survey anywhere in the United States, you would probably find fake news to be the term of the year. I have the good fortune to be trusted with teaching a course on fake news. It's under the auspices of the Osher Lifelong Learning Institute at the University of South Florida in Tampa. And one of the first things I do with my students, who, by the way, are all mature adults. This is a program for seniors where we discuss issues of the day, or we teach them how to do painting and watercolor, or we teach them how to play bridge, or we teach them conversational German. But at any rate, well, I'll talk more about that later. But at any rate, as part of the offerings that we have, we came up with this course on fake news. It was simply too immediate an opportunity to pass up. There is so much misinformation and lack of understanding of it that we really felt a responsibility to go ahead and launch this. There are 3 definitions of fake news that I start each term with. And if I may, I'll share them with you, and it may address some of your concerns about finding a definition. One definition is false or extremely exaggerated news stories used to generate money from ad revenue by using clickbait titles. Now, follow the money. I mean, we all learned that during Watergate, however many years ago. But the point is, a lot of the fake news that's out there is financially driven. Much of it goes to people in countries other than the United States. We may think we have a monopoly on fake news, but the Macedonian teenagers are reaping a fortune off the creation of fake news stories that then go out onto the Internet. The Internet being a global institution, it's not limited geographically, unless you're in a dictatorship. It's not limited geographically in terms of its influence. So that's one definition. False or extremely exaggerated news stories used to generate money from ad revenue by using clickbait titles. I maybe should spend just a second on clickbait titles. Clickbait titles are simply things that are designed to get you to stop on a story and click your mouse and read through the story. Typical clickbait titles might include, this is my opinion, might include things like the 17 greatest beaches not in Florida, because we know all the best beaches are in Florida. But, especially if you see a phrase like, you won't believe number 9. Okay, in order for you to find number 9, you've got to go through 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And even if the click-through rate in terms of compensation is portions of a penny, the simple number of people who are attracted to do this generates substantial revenues. So think clickbait, think money. The Urban Dictionary defines fake news quite simply as an article that doesn't validate your political opinion. You don't agree with it? Must be fake news. And I think that's probably the most, the highest element in our consciousness about what fake news might or might not be. Macmillan's dictionary says a sensational piece of news that does not map to reality, created to attract attention or to damage somebody's reputation. So there you've got 3, and, in answer to the obvious question, well, does that mean there's more than one type of fake news? Yes, it does. There are those that are more commercially driven. There are those that are more politically driven or reputation driven.
But let me stop you here, because the implication that I hear from the president and his minions is that these highly respected sources of news that are the network newscasters that have been giving us news all of our natural lives, right, at the newscast that this station just played at the top of the hour, are also providing us with fake news, because anything that in any way criticizes this president, he deems to be fake news. I think our listeners understand that the internet is awash with fake news. But when Brian Williams was caught red-handed misrepresenting the activities that happened to him in the Middle East, the network didn't say, oh, well, that's just more fake news. That's what you should expect from us. NBC fired him just for lying about one element, one thing in one story. Fired their most prominent, he was probably the highest paid anchor they'd ever had.
That's true.
He lost his job over one story. So if NBC is routinely generating fake news, they should be going through a newsman roughly every 2 to 3 days. Isn't that true?
I think that's a bit of a stretch. I mean, we've seen with the Me Too movement, we've seen a lot of people lose jobs very, very quickly recently. And granted, that's a totally separate issue, but with the amount of pressure that's placed on media today to meet financial objectives as well as informational objectives, there's perhaps a lower tolerance for documentable transgressions. We were talking earlier before the program. I went to an education in a traditionally liberal environment where we were expected to be familiar with the contents of the Sunday New York Times every Sunday. When I was in high school, we would be tested on that on Monday. When I went to college, you're 15 years old. You're reading the Sunday New York Times, you know. Then when I went to college, another college in a great liberal tradition, you were expected to be familiar with the contents of the New York Times every single day. And you might be tested on that material depending on the nature of your course. I didn't run into many tests on New York Times content in calculus, but in history or other disciplines, yeah, you could expect to have at least some discussion element concerning an article that might have appeared in the Times. I was probably 5 years out of college and well into the business world before it suddenly occurred to me that the New York Times, in many people's opinion, has a somewhat liberal bias when it comes to editorial approaches of stories. That thought simply, I mean, I had been so inculcated with the New York Times as the one newspaper of record, certainly, and unbiased in its nature. Obviously, from the way I'm putting this, I don't necessarily think that's the case these days. And interestingly, I don't know to what degree the American public appreciates the fact that there are inherent biases in everyone who has any part in producing, in writing, in filming, in presenting any newscast that they may hear.
And let's not forget consuming the news as well. It plays a large role in the kind of information which you will accept and that which you will reject.
Add to that the enormous economic pressures that most of today's news media are under. It's more than a tornado. It's more than a tsunami. The attack on the traditional news media, the traditional television networks, the traditional daily newspaper. I think probably 20 years ago, when I started doing seminars about newspaper as a competitor to the radio stations that I was managing at the time, newspapers were reaping millions of dollars a year in advertising from automotive accounts, car dealers.
All of the great fortunes were built on publishing.
And some of them right now are being passed on to other generations at significantly lower values
Or at least many
than
of
had
them.
been the
Most
case
of them, I
before.
should qualify that.
You know, I think the withdrawal of some major advertising accounts to go to internet first and then print perhaps has sucked a lot of resources out of some great newspapers.
Oh, yeah.
It's put some completely out of business. I mean, we're an example of that.
Google does more business in about an hour than the New York Times does all year. I know that's an exaggeration, but it's not much.
Well, and think of the other things that have happened. There were, I believe, at one point, more than 150 cities in America that had separately owned and competing daily newspapers.
Yeah.
Or if you don't want to call them cities, let's call them media markets.
Right.
Okay.
Like Tampa Bay.
Yeah.
Like Tampa Bay.
The Tribune, the
Today,
Independent.
that number, you can count that number today on your hands and your toes. No. So what happens there? What happens to the news that's available to you? What happens to how I, as a beleaguered newspaper publisher, allocate my resources? What stories do I cover? How do I cover them? Do I have the resources to look for alternate opinions? Do I have the resources to fact check? Well, maybe not the way I did 20 years ago.
Well, George, let me ask you a question here. Recently, the Washington Post was acquired by Jeff Bezos, who's the head of Amazon and one of the world's richest people, if not the richest. And so what we have now is the integration to a much greater degree of the Internet and its facilities with the print and newspaper. And what do you think this betokens?
Well, we're certainly seeing that. I have a slide in here. I brought along the slide pack from my class about the last great newspaper war. I don't know whether the people watching on over the Internet can see this, but the last great newspaper war to determine which one will survive, not which two or which three will share the honor of being the newspaper of record. But the perception on this article was in Hive, which I think is associated with the Washington Post, but I could be wrong. Anyway, the players in the last great newspaper war, according to this article, are Jeff Bezos with the Washington Post and the New York Times, and they will duke it out.
Of the Times is now owned by Carlos Slim, who is a Mexican multi-billionaire. I'm not sure where his interests are, but I'm sure the Internet is connected to them somehow.
Well, it's important to clarify that. I would not want anybody to tune out of this show later this evening and say, "Oh, wow, the New York Times is owned by Mexican interests." Carlos Slim is generally regarded as one of the richest people in America. He's been an enormously successful businessman. He is the largest stock owner in the New York Times. It is not voting stock necessarily, and it came in exchange for his hundreds of millions of dollars in financial support when they needed loans in order to continue their business in the way that they had become accustomed to. Now I see that another generation of Sulzbergers has moved into the management positions now. We'll see what kind of a difference that makes. It's interesting to look at just little things about the two newspapers. I read the Washington Post, and there's a little line that perhaps many people have never noticed that appeared a few months ago under the newspaper title on the cover page. It says, "Democracy dies in darkness." Democracy dies in darkness. And an interesting thought, and some would read that as being a commitment to the perpetuation of responsible journalism in the way that I think we'd all like to see. Even understanding that some newspapers will have some viewpoints that differ from our own,
Is that
differ
a phrase?
from others.
Is that a phrase which replaces all the news that's fit to print? That was their
Well, of
former-
course, the New York Times has been all the news that's fit to print.
Right.
I don't seem to see that as often with reference to the New York Times. But the other assumption is that most every effort to expand the coverage of newspapers through Internet activity has been a tremendous success. That is not necessarily true. In many cases, probably in most cases, the local newspaper will have the largest traffic of any local website. But there is enormous concern within the newspaper industry about how far they can push the toll gate when it comes to requiring you to pay before you get any information off that website.
But we're talking here about the finances of the news industry. My question to you is, are they giving us fake news? Are editors and journalists sitting around the editorial board table deciding how they want to steer opinion in this country and presenting us with reports and articles that are fake?
We're back to what your definition of fake is. Everybody who goes to work for the New York Times probably has a pretty good idea of the predominant editorial position of that newspaper. Likewise, the Washington Post. And as a counterbalance to that, the Wall Street Journal. You know that before you get in the door.
All right, but is that slanting the news or faking it? I mean, my opinion would be
how severely does it affect you, and how strongly do you disagree with it? That may be the difference.
A fake news story that I heard was that Michelle Obama's mother moved into the White House to help take care of the kids and ended up drawing a $130,000 a year pension, even though she never worked for the government. I know people that say this is not only true, but it's outrageous. This is an outrage. These people should be lined up against a wall and shot for this. And yet, of course, there's no truth to it whatsoever, because you can't draw a pension from the government if you've never worked for them. But that story circulated on the internet. It wasn't broadcast by Brian Williams or CBS News. It wasn't found in the Tampa Bay Times. It was fake news designed to discredit a particular political agenda. Are those news sources producing the same type of stories? Slanting the news is one thing, suggesting that a pro-environmental approach should be taken to how we spend our tax revenues, but coming out and literally accusing people in a political party of things that absolutely never happen is my definition of fake news. And I don't see the mainstream media doing that, but maybe I'm wrong. If I am, tell me.
I would like to think that the safeguards against willful misinformation or excessive slanting, if you will, are as strong today as they were 15 or 20 years ago in the major media. You can't extricate yourself from the economics in realizing that they simply are not. There aren't as many people. There's a reliance on outside sources. The New York Times has had its own case with writers who made up sources, made up stories, made up characters, and they've been fired ignominiously after the fact.
The Rolling Stone incident.
The Rolling Stone incident. I mean, look at the way this has mushroomed is beyond almost anybody's comprehension.
But George,
yeah,
how do these rather isolated and at least a few incidences compare to the Russians, whom I hear have 100 or more people whose full-time job is to create and spread false news all over the internet? One or two examples, from the New York Times or the Wall Street Journal or what have you. But compared to people who do it all day, every day, for a living, how effective are they? And is there really an army of fake newsers out there, which I hear there are?
Let's come back to our expectations.
Sure.
The Founding Fathers put into our Constitution as a primary element a safeguard for freedom of the press or freedom of speech. They expected more and they expected better. I don't know that anywhere in the Russian Constitution there is a documented freedom of speech or freedom of the press. There may well be. But I don't know that as we look at that from our pompous and self-satisfied position as Americans as we look at that, we wouldn't necessarily expect anything better out of many foreign governments. Mm-hmm. So, I think it has to be, what is it that we expect? And I think we expect our media to be perhaps purer than Caesar's wife.
You're listening to the Atheist Forum here on the Tan Talk Radio Network. Our guest is George Hyde. We're talking about fake news. We're going to visit the Voice of Atheism in Florida. We're going to take a short break to tell you a little bit about Atheists of Florida, and then we'll return to talk more about it and invite you to join the conversation at 441-3000 here on WTAN Tan Talk 1340. Atheists of Florida is a nonprofit membership organization founded in 1992. For over 25 years, Atheists of Florida has brought atheists together to address state-church separation issues, provide legal assistance in cases of religious discrimination in employment or educational institutions, help atheists meet others who want to live their lives free of religion, and produce the Atheist Forum. For membership information, visit our website at atheistofflorida.com, where you'll find our newsletters, annual reports, statement of purpose, and information about meetings and events. That's atheistofflorida.com. Ed Golly, Joe Reinhardt, Jim Peterson with you on the Atheist Forum. This morning, Andrew Young, who was the former mayor of Atlanta and an ambassador, appeared on some of the news talk programs because this is the weekend that we honor Dr. Martin King, Jr. So he was very closely associated with King back in the 60s during the movement that King spearheaded. He had a couple of quotes that I thought were interesting because he was applying them to the civil rights movement, and as I heard them, I applied them to religion. The first one was, quote, "Nothing is more dangerous in all the world than sincere ignorance and enthusiastic stupidity," unquote. This is from Dr. King. I thought, well, I can't think of a better definition of any of the world's major religions. But as he ended his interview, he also said, "All men sin and fall short of the glory of God, and women too. We are committed to God because we are sinners, and we know we cannot make it on our own." Well, it's a topic for another program, but the message to me is, Mr. Young, I can introduce you to dozens of people who don't even acknowledge the word sin, who live their lives every day without any reference to any kind of biblical guidance or rules, regulations that were handed down from previous generations, and live their lives without any sense of guilt, sin, or inadequacy. And that, of course, is one of our big problems with religion, is because it instills this attitude in us that no matter who we are, we're inadequate, horrible, despicable people who should be stepped on by cockroaches and are destined to grovel in hell, in fire and fury, because we've simply been human. We atheists are able to live our lives free of these intellectual encumbrances and invite you to do so too by contacting Atheists of Florida. Our website is atheistofflorida.com. You can listen to these programs, including archives, at talk.aff.ngo, or you can insult an atheist for $2. One sitting across the table from me has a target on his back. That would be your basic Joe Ryan.
I deserve it.
In studio with us, George Hyde, here on the Atheist Forum. And George, tell us, if you'd like, a little bit about your background and about what you're up to these days.
Well, thank you, Ed.
Sure.
I'm essentially retired, although I do a little consulting work in the broadcast business. That is my background, more than 50 years in the radio business, starting when I discovered that my math skills were not sufficient for me to get my chemical engineering degree from Brown, and I'd better find something else fairly quickly.
You could set a needle on a record.
Yes, I could set a needle on a record and maybe make a couple of bucks and have some fun doing it. So I did that. I started working at the campus radio station on the air back Well, let's just put it this way. My 50th reunion comes up in a few months.
And you know what a test tube is.
Yes. Well, I was with one particular company from Christmas Day of my freshman year at Brown, a commercial broadcasting company, which went on to become the third largest privately owned commercial radio company in the country. I worked for them in Providence. I became vice president of marketing at their corporate office and vice president of sales development. Went on to manage their stations in Cincinnati, no, not WKRP, but one that competed with similarly named stations. I had a fascinating experience in 7 years that I spent in Miami running the largest Spanish language stations in the United States. Spanish language news talk. There is no more high intensity format in the world than Miami-based Spanish language news talk. Along the way, I also supervised a news talk station in Orlando and the Florida network. When those stations were sold, I hooked up with the Radio Advertising Bureau, which is the largest broadcast trade association in the world, as executive vice president. I was there for 25 years, basically helping other broadcasters do a better job marketing their products to potential advertisers and advertising agencies. I set up our foreign operation, which was eventually grew to 42 countries, and I've done seminars and things in all 50 states. So when I retired and spent the better part of a year with a search engine optimization firm to get a little hands-on digital experience under my belt, and then retired again. And I've been involved with the Osher Lifelong Learning Institute at the University of South Florida. We call it OLLI. There are about 130 OLLI organizations across the country, one at St. Pete and Eckerd at St. Pete, another one just announced the other day at Ringling College in Sarasota, and ours at USF. And
but most important, you knew Dave and you know Lola.
I knew Dave.
Fine.
And I know Lola. Yes,
you're in.
Yes.
Okay.
So I teach a course on fake news, and I teach courses on other aspects of broadcasting as well for an audience that is 55 and older. And our courses start, my first class is a week from tomorrow in our new term. So if anyone is interested and they want to look at the 150 courses we're offering this term, they can go to usfseniors.org, usfseniors.org, and that'll give them all the information that they need.
And it's free, the course?
No, the courses are not free, but they're minimal. There are no exams. They are free of homework, and they are free of exams.
All right.
And I think there's a different dynamic when everyone in the room is mature, many of us retired or close to that. There's just people interact differently, and their bases of knowledge are different.
Yeah,
it's really it's a great value to me as a teacher slash learner. Yeah.
Because it's different when you have a lifetime of experience behind you instead of a lifetime of debt ahead of you. Is that right?
Yeah, that's part of it. The other thing is that most everybody else in the room has a lifetime of experience behind them in all kinds of different things.
Exactly.
And it's interesting to see where the bridges become built. There may be more danger, to come back to the issue of fake news. There may be potentially more short-term danger to be realized from websites, for example, that are not associated with organizations like NBC or even CNN. Although they make their mistakes, they mess up from time to time, and they are called to account for that. I can't even begin to count the number of websites that are out there purveying fake news. I saw one list of 450, but that list had changed by probably 50% the next time I downloaded the list. Here are some of the fake news stories that were carried on some of these sites last week. Dolly Parton said California's biblical disasters, quote unquote, were punishment for embracing Satan. I don't know how your audience will react to that. Do celebrities dine at a cannibal restaurant in New York? A more creative than usual Newswire piece claims that Katy Perry, Meryl Streep, and Chelsea Clinton have dined on human flesh.
Sounds plausible.
Tastes
We're
like chicken.
three Democratic senators busted for running an underage prostitution ring.
Sorry, that was Billary, wasn't it?
Yeah, right.
Let's get our fake story straight here.
Was Michelle Obama arrested for domestic violence? I point this out by saying that I downloaded these all today from a source called Snopes.com. And the process of equipping ourselves to identify, understand, and defend against fake news. And I really think we need to be defending ourselves, each one of us individually, intellectually, against fake news. This is probably a pretty good place to start. If you hear something that's just a little bit off, go to a source like Snopes, as snopes.com. I'm not compensated by Snopes, but it's a pretty good source for
But George, isn't it
debunking.
Isn't it just the electronic evolution of what used to be the newspaper, the tabloids that we'd see in the checkout counter, the Enquirer, Captain Smith found floating around in a lifeboat 80 years after Titanic.
Right. Yeah.
It's the same stuff. It draws us to it by the utter fascination and improbability of it.
Yellow journalism.
Right. But I don't hear that from the NBC Nightly News. So,
Yeah,
I mean, and the editor of Enquirer says, well, his reporters aren't as good as mine.
But anybody with very little effort can find out that there's something probably bogus about these types of sites. On the other hand, when the President of the United States comes out and repeatedly calls major news organizations such as CNN fake news and all kinds of other epithets designed to degrade their reporters and to diminish their veracity in the public eye. This is not just fake news. This is, without a doubt, always has been the first step towards fascism. I hate to sound like I'm waving the bloody shirt or being too alarmist, but that's historically what has always happened. They take over the press, they control the press, and they control what everybody can think. And one of the ways, of course, to do that is to point out that the existing press is bogus and has this unreliable, has this animosity towards the powers that be that borders on illegal, if not treasonous. That's the opinion that we're getting from the White House, and that's the way I hear it, for sure.
Then you would be likely to hear a more strident cry, I think, for the implementation of limitations on the ability of the press to exist.
Trump last week says, I want to look at the libel laws. You know,
well, he's allowed to do that.
Yes,
I mean, they are laws.
Yes, he's allowed to look at them. They ought to be strong. Weaker.
Here's, well, you know, you can argue that in a separate show with a libel lawyer. You know, I think at this point, I am willing to place great faith in the abiding nature of the First Amendment. I really believe that when our founding fathers, and that's a hackneyed term now, but when our founding fathers put that in, they meant it. And I believe that for more than 200 years now, we have acted like they meant it. And I don't think I'm not sure there would ever be a time, but I don't think the time is now for the consideration of any movement which would temper that fundamental freedom. I think the chances of that happening are pretty darn slim.
I think they'd be far less likely if the President of the United States weren't deliberately trying to chip away at them himself.
Well, regardless.
It is.
I think we'd have to agree, though. Excuse me, Jim, for just a minute.
I've been an ACLU member for 40 years. Nobody needs to sell me on the First Amendment. I do want to say that.
Good. There come responsibilities with that, however. And the diffraction of the news media, the promulgation of the number of sources, whether they are sources in, the teenagers' homes in Macedonia who are making money writing these clickbait fake news stories, okay, or wherever they're coming from. The responsibility, I believe, has, and this, you may consider this to be unfortunate, but I believe some of the responsibility has shifted from the news purveyor to the news consumer.
Right.
We cannot today escape the obligation, if we're going to be productive, and everybody's, 2 out of 3 are nodding their heads. That's probably a pretty good record in this
You have
in
a
this room.
responsibility to research it yourself.
You have a responsibility to, before you leap in and say, oh my gosh, that's absolutely right, at least think for a millisecond and go, that doesn't sound quite right to me. Maybe that's not exactly what the story is. Here are some things to look for when you do that. This is part of my crusade for the improvement of critical thinking when it comes to consumption of news in America. Here are some of the key characteristics of, you used the term bogus earlier, I'll use the term bogusness, even though I'm not sure it's a word.
It is now.
It is now, yeah. Number one, the author is anonymous. You can't find a name associated with the story. Number two, the author is supposedly famous, but you can't necessarily find anything that backs up that fame. Number three, the article refers to a source that, when you check it out, you find to be completely contradictory. This happens a fair amount in environmental news, by the way. That there are some claims that are made that are exactly to the contrary of what were claimed in the original article. The article is riddled with spelling errors. Were you good spellers in school?
I kind of was.
I was a pretty good speller. I mean, to this day, I go through Publix and change, take down the signs and bring them to the manager and say, you got bananas spelled wrong on this. I mean, there's. My wife says that's a little crazy, but it's a tip-off to me when I read a story that is riddled with spelling errors, that perhaps we're not dealing with something that would have passed the stricter qualifications of an NBC or the New York Times. The author loves using exclamation points and bold-faced letters. You can see that one better on the slide.
That's amateur hour in the front row, isn't it?
Yeah.
They do that.
Yeah.
Yes.
The article argues that it is not a hoax. How many articles have you seen that start off, this is not a hoax, this is absolutely true?
There was no
this may look
collusion.
false.
Absolutely no collusion.
Right. And finally, number 7, if there's math involved, try doing the math. You may not have been a good student in math, but do the math. Sometimes it's just not even close enough to be marginally believable. Is there help on the way? Perhaps. Now, we hear a lot about what is being done, and actually the folks at Poynter, the Poynter Institute down in St. Pete, are doing some work on this on behalf of the newspaper industry. Where that will go, I don't know. It's a survival item for people with legitimate news sites. If that entire business loses credibility because of the sheer tonnage of fake news, that will be an enormous opportunity that they will have lost. There are starting to be some digital ways of refining people's skills in identifying fake news. One is a site developed by the Department of Education and Berkeley, I think, in California, called Factitious, a game that tests your news sense. And you're presented with certain scenarios and asked to guess whether you think the scenario is positive or negative. There's one in here that's absolutely great. It talks the article talks about the negative effects of dihydrogen
Water.
dihydrogen oxide.
Right, water.
And it's a dihydrogen oxide. It's bad for you. Don't do this. Don't do that. And the question is that well, dihydrogen oxide? Even though I didn't make it to being a licensed chemical engineer, H2O is H2O.
Right.
So
90% of acid rain is 99%.
well, you would be amazed at the percentage of functioning adults who don't necessarily realize that. So we're going to need some help on this. We're going to need some friends. Some of it is coming along in websites. I don't know how much of it we're going to find from places like Facebook. Facebook is, I think they're constantly shifting algorithms. Facebook flies in the face of the things I was brought up to do. I was brought up to learn more and more about more different things. Facebook, by very virtue of the algorithm, brings you more things about fewer subjects,
Right.
depending on what you like to read about. And I'm not sure that's good for our overall national
Sure.
psyche.
Joe, can you tell us what a fecal crater is?
A fecal crater?
It's a country we don't want immigrants from.
Oh,
Hey!
I see.
One of those. Well, one of the principal problems that we have, however, is that sites like Factitious and Snopes will be regularly visited by people who already feel motivated to take an interest in news and to confirm its factual nature. But the problem is that there are a very large proportion of the populace who do not feel so motivated, who do not have the requisite body of knowledge at their command that came from their educational system. And so, consequently, they are likely to accept and act upon information that is clearly incorrect or complete opposite from the truth of the matter.
And there are
So what sort of public policy measures or public education, whatever, can we undertake, in your estimation, to try to popularize critical thinking and factual information?
there are millions and millions of people who are in the camp that Jim just described, who are there because they have a conclusion, and they're simply looking at they started with a conclusion and want to assemble facts to support that, and the internet is great for that.
Confirmation bias, I suppose, in another sense. Long-term solution probably involves our education system, should involve our education system. A lot of the people who I spent a lot of time with at OLLI discussion courses on politics and current events talk about the decline in critical thinking skills in the U.S. I know it's a concern, but we're 65 and 70-year-old people, and not everybody listens to us the way we did when we were under 30.
As they should.
And so there's probably an element of that. I have to tell you, I think more of the responsibility will have to be borne by families. And that's often difficult because if the heads of a family have strong opinions about a subject, particularly a political subject, they won't necessarily be inclined toward emphasizing the importance of critical thinking if it tends to debunk one of the positions that they would historically be advocating. But
Well, do you think that perhaps that more emphasis on on things like literature and poetry, the humanities in general, history, civics, music, art, the whole number of disciplines which make up a large part of what we call Western civilization, do we need to somehow make a deliberate effort to put more money and more effort into our education system to ensure that every person, every citizen has an opportunity to at least acquaint themselves with the most basic facts about these matters and science and all the other information that they will need to be functional citizens, which it is clearly evident most people do not have now.
I think that's the underpinning of a liberal education, which is the way I was brought up, and that, of course, makes it the right way. But that's only my opinion. I think it's hard to say to someone who's perhaps in a depressed economic situation, you can go to point A and learn coding and be 20 years old and making $80,000 a year, or before you do that, if you want to be a really complete citizen, you'll go over here and do this poetry workshop and a few other things.
And make half that.
And if the job is still there 2 years down the road when you finish that, yeah, they may take you on. Your codes may be more elegant, I don't know, but I think that's a tough sell given the economic constraints that a lot of people find themselves under today.
At this moment, that's certainly true. But we're looking at a future that's been predicted to have a good deal more leisure time available. The length of time people will spend in future jobs will be much shorter than it is now because of cybernetics and the increased use of automation and robots and so forth will make it less necessary for people to participate in a lot of jobs that they're currently doing, which means that there's now time available for people to develop their cultural interest, expand their knowledge, and become functional citizens. So maybe that would be a way out that we should look at.
Oh, brave new world that has such people in it.
More time to watch football. Who are you kidding?
I'm afraid, yes.
A recent survey ranked the trustworthiness of a variety of news sources, and I thought you might be just interested in an excerpt or two. This was conducted by the Journalism School at the University of Missouri, and the most trusted entity among the people who they surveyed was The Economist. Number 2 was Public Television. Number 3, Reuters. Number 4, the BBC. You can tell this is not just your average group that got pulled in on the street. NPR, PBS, The Guardian, The Wall Street Journal, LA Times, Dallas Morning News. Mentioned as not trusted, the number 1 there was Occupy Democrats. Number 2, BuzzFeed. Number 3, Breitbart.
Oh, yeah.
So there was a certain amount of cross-party activity.
Did Fire and Fury fit anywhere in there, or is that yet to be determined?
Well, they haven't done that survey.
George Hyde, how do we reach you again?
The best way to do it would be by email, g.hyde, HYDE, @yahoo.com.
We thought you were going to be a big bust tonight. Just mail the show in, but I think I can speak for both of my co-hosts in saying we could spend the rest of the night talking and listening to you.
Yeah,
it's just been great, and we hope we can have you again sometime here on the Atheist Forum. Hope you'll join us again next week here on the Forum. Now, along with Joe Reinhardt, Jim Peterson, I'm Ed Golly, reminding you, if the story seems a little too implausible to be true, don't believe it just because somebody wrote it down.
Make them prove it.
You have been listening to the Atheist Forum. To learn more about Atheists of Florida, visit our website at atheistofflorida.com. Continue the discussion on our website, talk.aof.ngo. Join us again next Sunday for another edition of the Atheist Forum here on Tan Talk 1340.